Welcome to the second episode in a two-part Legendarium series about the strange story of Perkin Warbeck. In part 2, The Road to Tyburn, we will talk about how Perkin Warbeck attempted to overthrow King Henry VII of England. Perkin Warbeck began a long migration around the courts of Europe in search of support. King Charles VIII of France received Perkin as Richard of York. Margaret of Burgundy acknowledged him as her nephew. He even attended the funeral of Emperor Frederick III in 1493 at the invitation of Emperor Maximilian I. Warbeck made his first attempt to invade England with the help of Margaret of Burgundy. A small force landed near Deal on July 3, 1495, hoping for prince and peasant alike to flock towards them. Instead, Tudor militia drove them into the sea. Warbeck abandoned the venture without even disembarking and again made for Ireland. With the support of the Earl of Desmond, he besieged Waterford, but when the town resisted with unexpected tenacity, he withdrew to Scotland. There, Warbeck received a royal welcome. He married the king's cousin, Lady Catherine Gordon, and received a monthly pension of £112. King James IV of Scotland saw him as a club to beat the Tudors with. Of course, King Henry VII knew that an obscure claimant with foreign backing could seize the throne. After all, he did the same less than 15 years ago. So Henry Tudor declared his younger son, also named Henry, to be the real Duke of York, which of course made Perkin Warbeck a fraud. In Westminster Palace, young Henry joined his fellow Knights of the Bath, who placed him in a ceremonial tub. The Earl of Oxford read to him the solemn admonition required of a knight. "Be strong in the faith of the Holy Church, protect all widows and oppressed maidens, and above all earthly things, love the king thy sovereign lord." King Henry VII dipped his hand in the water, made the sign of the cross, and kissed young Henry's forehead. The other knights of the Bath dressed him in a hermit's robe and took him into a chapel, where young Henry kept vigil through the night. Afterwards he mounted a mighty charger and rode it through Westminster Hall. There his father dubbed young Henry a knight. In his nursery, his mother long regaled him with tales of oaths, maidens in distress, disguises, transformations, hermits, and kings. Now he joined the fantasy world of his imagination. All his life, Henry always saw himself, no matter how badly he behaved after becoming King Henry VIII, as a chivalrous knight. Of course, the young knight would not fight in his father's first war. The Scots briefly invaded England in 1496 to install Perkin Warbeck on the throne, but when no English militias rose in favor of their pretender, the Scots withdrew. The sorry adventure served only as an excuse for Henry Tudor to raise taxes for defense. Now an embarrassment to the Scottish king, Warbeck returned once more to Ireland. A rising in Cornwall against the tax increases in June 1497 led Warbeck to expect support there. On September 12th, he arrived near Land's End with just 112 men crammed into 2 ships. Their final invasion proved the most successful. By the time his force reached royal forces led by the Earl of Exeter, Perkin Warbeck led several thousand men. The terror of a rebel invasion even reached the royal family. A chronicler wrote, "There was great fear in London, and cries were made, 'Every man to his harness! To harness!' Some ran to the gates, others mounted the walls, so no part remained undefended." Young Henry heard these anguished cries and knew his family's lives hung in the balance. Queen Elizabeth of York rushed young Henry and her other children from Elton to London with its strong walls. Thankfully, the Cornish rebels found the River Thames in their way. By the time the rebels slogged their way to Blackheath, King Henry VII had mustered enough men to challenge them. The rebels wielded only staves and sticks, and Warbeck fled once more. He took refuge in Beaulieu Abbey and finally surrendered. In his confession to King Henry VII at Taunton on October 5, 1497, Warbeck confessed to being the son of a bourgeois in Tournai. He said he had come to Cork in 1491 as a merchant's apprentice to model clothes. Though some of the ringleaders of the Cornish rebellion went to the chopping block, Warbeck merely went into custody until he attempted to escape in June 1498 and failed. He then traveled under guard to the Tower of London. Early in 1499, yet another false Warwick arose in opposition to Henry. Though Tudor forces quickly suppressed the uprising, the episode may have convinced Henry VII of the wisdom of disposing with Warbeck altogether. King Henry VII sent an agent provocateur into the cell next to Warbeck. The agent convinced Warbeck to agree to a conspiracy which involved burning down the Tower of London, escaping to Flanders, and placing the Earl of Warwick, the last living Plantagenet, upon the throne. After Warbeck confessed to the mad scheme, King Henry VII needed nothing more. On November 23, 1499, executioners drew Perkin Warbeck on a hurdle from the tower to Tyburn. This rough ground where a stand of elms grew on the banks of the Tay River served as a disposal place for criminals since the days of Richard the Lionheart. It took several minutes for the pretender to die. As he gasped his last, women rushed forward to press their faces against his still twitching hands in the belief they would cure blemishes. Children gripped his legs to swing in the air as he jerked about. Mothers held up sickly infants to him in the hope that the sight of a dying man would cure their children. Afterwards, the hangman sold Warbeck's rope as a talisman against disease. With Warbeck now nothing but a memory and the rebellion crushed, young Henry Tudor could return to his studies in peace and eventually grow up to become King Henry VIII. Meanwhile, Perkin Warbeck, who might have gone on to a prosperous career as a textile merchant in one of the richest regions of Europe, died ignominiously upon the gallows because he chose to pursue the mad dream of Yorkist exiles. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.